Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you have all joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located in Piscataway and Susquehannock Land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Victoria Walton. Victoria is an emerging visual artist based in Baltimore. They have an MFA in ceramic art from New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University and a BFA with a focus in ceramics from Towson University. Victoria explores the wonder and complexity of Black identity, creating large-scale sculptures and video works that center the narratives of women and gender, expansive people. Walton draws from their own life, reflecting on the intersection of her identities and ongoing battle with her health. She further investigates the impact that historic societal factors and personal experiences have on the individual and the Black community, making multi-layered connections between clay and the body. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. And I will now turn it over to Victoria.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for meeting me during this artist talk, and also thank you to Baltimore Clayworks, who not only hosts me as a short-term resident, but just for providing me this opportunity to talk about my work. Just give me a moment while I set up my screen. So I am a ceramic artist, but I like to expand into other mediums. So I really consider myself multidisciplinary. I am a disabled artist and I really focus between figurative work, but also abstracting the body into something that becomes resembles nature itself. Most of the work that I'm going to show is from my MFA thesis show, which I just graduated from Alfred University back in May of this year. And so here in this work, this is one of my largest works to um, currently is called Tread Lightly. And Tread Lightly is a standing full figure ceramic sculpture of a Black person with short cropped hair, um, bronze treatment, and thorns are protruding from the body. There's soil covering the feet, and there's this engagement with a tree root at the base of the sculpture. And so over the course of my practice, I've been really grappling with how to how to take the viewer on this journey in this investigation of the self, and also how does being a Black person um um and how does living in the Black experience um how can we explore that, and how does that also ripple outside the body, and also how does that how does that show up inside the body? I took off at Towson University when I discovered clay for the first time. It was largely something that I had never had experience with growing up. Ceramics was not a medium that I had any notion of largely. And so I was interested in fashion design for most of my life and worked with pattern making and sewing, and I went to FIT. And so when I stumbled onto ceramics, my my instantly went to connection back to the figure. My whole life I had been really surrounded around form and creating and working from a flat pattern and using that to take up volume. And so being surrounded by models in the body and the figure and taking these abstract concepts and making them more material, that's something that had been the language of what I had been doing for most of my life. But working with clay transported those ideas to something that had more permanence, that had more meaning to me. And also at that time of my life, it became a vehicle for me to explore what I was even going through personally. Around that time, I had been diagnosed with severe chronic illness. And so I started to grapple with pain, with identity, how um, pain, whether it be emotional, whether it be physical, whether it be psychological, really like what are the prints on the body that are left from that experience and what do we carry with us? And so I started to explore this by fragmenting the figure. I worked largely with sculpting faces and creating assemblages and making these more compact sculptures. But then I also started thinking about if I'm really talking about trauma, if I'm really talking about personal experience, I need to kind of delve into the realm of the full figure. And so I started to imagine and started to conceptualize how to go about doing that. And so I, at that time, fell in love with slab building. And so not only were my ideas kind of going along on a track, but also the techniques in which I wanted to work in drastically changed and went to hyper focus. And so um, within the last year of my time at Towson, I was doing larger slab building and I was really trying to build that proficiency towards the full figure. Because ultimately, as I've come to go on this journey, I do believe that um, when we're talking about figurative work, the larger the work is, the more we have a tendency to relate it back to ourselves. It becomes a window or a picture towards our own experiences. And so we're able to relate to it into a deeper way. So um I went to graduate school at Alfred University, but I've been based in Baltimore for the last few years and kind of going back and forth. And I started to um really think about our environment and how our environment and that we are in Baltimore, where obviously we're thinking we're surrounded by this infrastructure and also surrounded by a level of decay and erosion when it comes to that infrastructure. But then also there's this there was these green spaces and there's this we're still in touch with nature. And I think I started looking at how those they started to interplay with each other. Um, and I really thought about like the urban Black experience and how these are often the only moments we really have living in places like this to engage with something with nature in a larger context, right? Um, and so it started to be evolve beyond the figure, and I started to really think about how do I build little worlds? How do I kind of create space around the figure that also reinforces the trauma and also reinforms the kind of experiences that Black people can go through? So for this work, this was one of my first pieces where slab building at a life-size scale or fragmented, but also using textiles, going back to that language that I had before ceramics, when I was working with fabrics, when I was working with textiles, and really merging that. And that has been a really surprising part of my practice, and thing I didn't necessarily anticipate. The fact that I was going to start melding ceramic um, with this mixed media approach of other materials, but it really makes sense for just who I am as a person, but also the kind of worlds that I'm trying to reflect. Something wonderful that's also been a part of my practice is, really using models and images of people from here. And so, having photo shoots of my friends, having photo shoots of other people that I know that greatly informed the work, particularly in a place where I didn't necessarily have access to the type of models that I would like to have or the references that I would like to have. And so it became a way for me to um, bring Baltimore like into my work and also to work with the diversity of Black people that I'm interested in sculpting. And so for me, I think about inclusivity in terms of a wide range of things. I think about it in terms of gender, think about it in terms of sexuality. I think about it in terms of body types. And I also think about it in terms of um, and like posture and gesture and how I can really show that even though we have common links, even though we, as people of African descent, obviously we have so many commonalities that we also are so individual and we're so different and we each have our own stories. And so this has been a wonderful part of my practice for me to be able to bring some of the people that I know into this work. I dealt with trauma primarily in my work based off of my own experience, based on my disability and my illness. Um, and of course, not of course, but I did also use that as a reference to think about collective trauma and other experiences that people were having. But there was a turn for me where I decided to be intentional about investigating um, disability history and intentional about sculpting the disabled body. And that was a turn for me and really was the first full circle to me in inclusivity. So I'm talking about all these things, I'm talking about, um, but as a disabled person, I felt like I could not really talk about the experience by only just talking about myself. I needed to expand, I needed to do my research, I needed to continue to speak to other folks who were in other various situations different than myself, but also had common links. And this became something that has changed my focus, changed um, the the route of what I do, and it is a burning passion for me as a person. And so I do think of myself as an activist. I think of myself that makes, and I think that has happened over time where I don't just make work um, for aesthetics or for even personal reasons all the time. I'm really using that to say something, to directly comment on what's happening in society, to directly call out the constriction that society has put on Black, brown, queer, trans, disabled people. And so that kind of ramped up those messages in my work for me. And so through this exploration, I start to um, look at the way that disabled people had been referenced in other sculptural art forms by other artists, and I started to see what they were doing as well and what my path would be like. So, beyond my own disability, something that has also, there's a lot of full circles. Something that also really rang true for me is that disability has been a part of my life from the beginning. My brother, who was born right after me, has autism and was more, very much so more severe when he was younger. And so that was my primary relationship to disability when I was younger. And it's even, I think it's so interesting now how those relationships have grown off of each other or now inform each other. Um, and so when I'm making this work, I've also really reflected on what I've learned by being his eldest sibling, and also from seeing the restrictions that he's had to navigate, seeing the way that the system treats disability from this angle in terms of education, resources. Um, that's something that's come into the work as well. So beyond ceramics, I also was working with other materials and found wood and um, particularly tree roots really spoke to me just about this timelessness, the timelessness of our lineages, not only as Black people, but as disabled people and also as queer people, and how those intersections really do work together. And it's just like we've always been here. And so I've been using that as that imagery over and over again in my work recently, and I've and I think it's interesting where the ceramic comes into my work and where it doesn't now. And I'm really looking forward to more opportunities where I get to go large scale again. But um, this work, Circle of Life, we are portals to what is unseen, really is also the direction where my work is going outside ceramic, where I'm not only taking up space with material, but I'm taking up space in the imagination for disabled people, and I'm taking up that space using nature as a material. And so that's something that um, I'm I found that has really worked for me, really communicated those messages of value and worth, um, and how we're integral to the framework of nature. So I'm kind of I've gone between, really expanding beyond my own experience, really relying on disability history um and all these other this other research I've been doing, but then also still remaining very personal. And so this work is called Body Stigma: What I Am and What I Am Not. And it was my own exploration of pain and also my own exploration of stigma of disabled people, um, and how most of the things that we experience are really imposed upon us. They have really nothing to do with, um, they really have everything to do with people's perception of us and their own sense of standards and rigidity and what is allowed. And so this was a really interesting commentary on what I feel like is so pervasive within society, so pervasive within our culture. Um, and also is mixed media, which, bringing in those textiles and also bringing in soil, which has really become a large part of my work. So working large scale as well. This was another work of mine called Like a Thorn. And so here I'm also reflecting on representation of disabled people in life-size sculpture, in the full figure, in a way we're so used to seeing the body fragmented over and over again, but did we realize that this is really how people live. I think we become desensitized to that. And so this was a moment for me to go beyond fragmentation and really think about the disabled body, and also um kind of playing with this whole thing of um, it was actually wonderful to see that engagement with the viewers. Like, what is your reaction when you don't have the information and you come across the piece for the first time? Do you perceive for there to be something wrong? Like, so I think my work also acts as a mirror to be like, what is your reaction to these pieces? What is your reaction um to witnessing people that are different than you? So, something that I've really enjoyed going into is exploring the vessel in a different way. To, I've been primarily working with the figure, but for this, I was like, how can I kind of abstract the body, um, use the vessel in a way that is beyond function and is really kind of um that works in this relationship with tension within a system that is constricting it. And so I've really been thinking about constriction. I've really been thinking about what resistance means, um, and how there's levels of resistance and constriction. And so just in that same diversity of how I like to show Black people in many different ways. This was an example where each of these pots, each of these vessels is within its own mechanism, is within its own individual, and that is kind of grappling or wrestling with the system of constriction in its own unique way. And some are more extreme than others. And I think it really gets it's a very subtle but potent way of really thinking about, do we really have bodily autonomy? Who allows us, and why do we feel like, now what are the parameters that are stopping us from freedom, stopping us from um, experiencing, from going through life without fear, without harm. And so I really enjoyed this series and the kind of endless possibilities that it contains within it. And I'm really excited to continue working with the vessel and the nets, and then also play with different arrangements of those things. And like I said before, Tree Roots really became central to my installation work, really going back to the environment create. So I showed that earlier work when I was first working with the textiles and thinking like, how can I create an environment beyond the figure? And I realized that taking up more space, actually bringing the earth into the studio, into the gallery, was the only way I could really, I don't know, do that in a way where you couldn't walk away from it, where you really had to encounter it. And so, um, I think that's something that I'm excited to continue to work at various scales. Is like, how can we engage with nature? How can we also not confront, but be reminded of um um of the power of staying true to who we are and remembering where we come from, remembering our roots, and remember that we are connected to each other within culture, within shared identity, and within shared experience. So this is me at Clayworks at this moment as a resident. And I've been working at a smaller scale. And so I've been kind of exploring how to not go backwards in time, but then to work with a smaller scale of my work I do want people to still encounter it um and to be confronted with the figure, but I do think that yeah, I'm looking forward to all the different opportunities that I can create and not maybe quieter ways and also with a larger installation. And so right now I'm really thinking about Black queer and trans relationships, primarily romantic ones. And so I'm looking at the way that I can combine figures. And so there's a lot of looping and there's a lot of joining these bodies together. And so I'm excited for this play that's happening in the studio. And yeah, and so working between like smaller works and then also the opportunities where I get to make my larger figures again. But it's been wonderful having the chance to be in the studio and to be in Baltimore and to make again. I think it's been really enjoyable for me. And I think that is the end of my talk.